God, thanks a lot for inviting us to your table today so that we may hear and study your word. Help your word to refresh us and strengthen us as we go forward in your service. Amen. Now, from last time, as sort of a review, I would like somebody to read John chapter 20, verses 30 to 31.
What did you say, 20, 30 to 31?
Chapter 20, 30 to 31.
Okay. Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name.
Now, what do you think he intended when he wrote that? Does that sound like the end of the book to you?
Yeah.
Does, doesn't it?
Sort of, yeah.
You know, so the question is, where did chapter 21 come from? So we're going to talk about where chapter 21 came from, and that's because it's got a lot of theology in it, a lot of deep theology in it, that when we discuss it, it's going to say, I never thought about that when we read this. So the first section we're going to read is called The Risen Christ, and would somebody like to read chapter 21, verses 1 to 14?
Afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas called Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. I'm going out to fish, Simon Peter told them. And they said, well, we're with you. So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, friends, haven't you any fish? No, they answered. He said, throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some. When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it was the Lord. As soon as Simon Peter heard him say it was the Lord, he left his outer garment around him, and he had taken it off and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from the shore, after about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire, burning coals, there was fish on it, and some bread. Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish you had just caught. Simon Peter climbed aboard and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153, but even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. And the disciples dared ask him, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread, and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the 3rd time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead.
Okay. John ends the book, and then he adds this story to it. Okay? Now, there's a lot going on here. First of all, it says Simon Peter, and it says Thomas. What do we know about Thomas?
He's the doubter.
He's the doubter. So Thomas is with him. Nathanael from Cana in Galilee. The sons of Zebedee. Who are they? James and this guy. So they're back. They're sort of back home. Okay. Obviously, remember Peter had left the business there, and so did the sons of Zebedee. He left it with their father. So somehow this boat would be there. It was theirs. They could use it anytime they wanted. Also, William Barclay points out at that time, fishing at night was very common. What they used to do is they used to have a torch where they would use and take it from one side of the boat to the other to see where they could find the schools of fish, and then if they found one, they would throw in the net to catch it. Apparently the net had some sort of weights on it, so that it would, part of it would go down and the fish would swim into the net. So basically, it's not all unusual that they would be doing all of this. Now, it's also possible, notice what happened when Jesus went to the beach and said something. What does it say the disciples did? They did not, they didn't recognize him. And it's possible, it's early in the morning, they're a few feet out, it's possible they weren't even expecting it, so chances are they didn't put two and two together. Whatever the reason, they didn't see him right away. Then the disciple who Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." Notice it's not Peter who saw him first, it's John who wrote this book. Notice, what does it say then that Peter did? It's in verse 7. Well, he's going to jump in the water. Why would you put your clothes on? Well, apparently, according to William Barclay, in those days, it was considered disrespectful to greet a high teacher or a rabbi or somebody like that without being dressed, fully dressed. So that's why Peter put his thing on and then jumped in the water. Normally, fishermen jump in the water all the time, and they're dressed for it. So he made sure he threw that in there. Then, how many fish does it say he caught? 153. Not 100, not 150, not about 100. 153 exactly. You realize scholars have been pondering for over 1,000 years why it's 153.
I was going to say they probably want to know what 153 means.
Well, the most logical explanation is that since there were so many people there, usually they would take the count and divide it up equally, so they had to know how many there were. So chances are that was the reason. However, there's a whole lot of other people that came up with some dandies. In the 5th century, Cyril of Alexandria said the number of 153 is made up of 3 things. First, there is 100 that represents the fullness of the Gentiles. 100, he says, is the fullest number. I don't know what fullest number means, but apparently in those days that's what they believed. The shepherd's flock is full of 100, it says in Matthew. The seeds for fertility is 100-fold. So 100 stands for the fullness of the Gentiles who will be gathered into Christ. Second, there is the 50. The 50 stands for whoever is left of Israel that they're going to allow in. So you've got all the Gentiles, you've got the people of Israel that listen to them, so that's 150. Third is the 3, and 3 stands for the Trinity. So that's where that 153 comes from. Now St. Augustine didn't buy that logic. He says 10 is the number of the law, for there are 10 commandments. 7 is the number of grace, for the gifts of the Spirit are 7-fold. So now 7 plus 10 makes 17. Okay? So what does 17 have to do with 153? If you add up 1, 2, 3, 4 up to 17, it adds up to 153. So it stands for all those either by law or by grace that have been moved to come to Jesus Christ. Now, so this is I'm trying to give you some ideas here. You might want to come up with your own ideas. The simplest explanation is given by the 4th century biblical scholar Jerome. He said that in the sea there are 153 different kinds of fish. I don't know how he knew that, but let's assume he's right. And that the catch is one which includes every kind of fish, and therefore the number and symbolizes the fact that someday all people of all nations will be gathered into Christ. I bet you all knew that when you read that 153.
I knew you were going to come up with something.
But that's, actually, he says, the great catch of fishes was gathered in the net. Net held them all and was not broken. According to William Barclay, the net stands for the church, and there is room for the church for all people of all nations. Even if they all come in, the church is big enough to hold them all. Here John is telling us in his own vivid yet subtle way of the universality of the church. There is no kind of exclusiveness in the church, no kind of prejudice or selectiveness. The embrace of the church is as universal as the love of God and Jesus Christ. This will lead us on to the next great reason why this chapter was added to the gospel, if we note that it was Peter who drew the net to the land. So the first reason he added it was to prove two things. Number one, hallucinations don't cook breakfast. Sounds silly, but think about it. Hallucinations do not cook breakfast. Jesus was cooking breakfast. Jesus lit a fire. Hallucinations don't light fires either. Now, we have since learned there's no such thing as mass hallucination anyway, but be that as it may. So, what John is saying is only a real living person...
Mass hysteria.
Yeah, mass hysteria.
Yeah, but not mass hallucination.
What was that guy's name that all those people died?
Yeah.
Jim Jones or whatever his name was. And they all believed in him, and they listened to whatever he said, and they all died.
Now that's listening to what he said. What they're talking about is being 20 people in a room saying the same hallucination of something in front of their eyes. Okay. That is not real, according to the experts. But let's assume that so John assumed though that it was. So he's pointing out, yes, this guy was here, he did all these things that only a living person could do. Now there's some who argue, well, maybe there was a living person hiding behind a rock somewhere. But the reality of it is, he would, apparently when he wrote his gospel, his whole gospel, remember, was to prove that Jesus was the one, the only living Christ. So someone must have questioned it. So now he's added this to say, well, if you don't believe that, if you don't believe he appeared to us in the locked room, and now here's something that only a person could do, and now you have to believe it. So that was the first point, is that he did all of that, and while he did all of that, he also stuck in there all that symbolism about the church. Now, the average person who reads this is probably not going to figure it out. But about the church part, about the 153, and then that's not breaking, and all that kind of thing. So that's the first reason that people believe that this chapter was added maybe afterwards. Their reasoning is that John lived to be very, very old. They don't know exactly how old. But he certainly outlived practically all of the disciples. And he had plenty of time to amend his own book if he wanted to.
But old in those days wasn't very old though, right?
Yes, but he was very, very old, whatever that means. So if old is 40, he might have been 65 or 70, I mean, that's... Yeah, so apparently they always described him as very, very old. So now there's a second reason he adds it, and that's John 21:15-19. Would somebody like to read that?
Okay. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Peter, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these? Yes, Lord. He said, you know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. I tell you the truth, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which people would glorify God. Then he said to him, follow me.
Okay. A lot going on here. Why do you think Jesus asked Peter the same question 3 times?
Because he denied him 3 times.
Exactly. Because he denied him 3 times. And in each case, what did Jesus do? He started with, who was first? Feed what?
He was sheep.
The lambs. So he's got the children out there. Then who does he say? Take care of my sheep. He says, take care of my sheep. Okay? That means lead them and make sure they don't get into trouble and all that. What is the third thing he says? It's on the it's in the second paragraph on feed my sheep. So he said, feed my lambs, take care of my sheep, and now feed my sheep. Each one of these is a lot higher level of commitment. I mean, it's one thing to show a bunch of sheep where to go. Now you got to feed them something. So not only do you have to show them where to go, but you got to know where the food is. So each time, Jesus is increasing the commitment that Peter has to have. Now, in verse 19, he says, Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death which Peter would glorify God. So what clue does that give you when John wrote this? Yes. So either John was either guessing or he wrote it after Peter died. He said, you know, it would, you know, the kind of death. So if you recall, Peter was crucified by the Romans, and what was different about the way he was crucified? Yeah.
He was upside down.
He was upside down.
Wasn't he?
Yeah, and he did not want to die the same way Jesus did, because he wasn't worthy.
Why did they do that to him?
He asked them to.
Oh.
That's why I said he didn't want to die the other way, because he didn't feel he was worthy.
Was he the only disciple that was crucified upside down?
Yeah, but the others were martyred in all kinds of different ways. Most all of them were beheaded, or whatever it might be. So basically what he's saying here is that he is responding to Peter's denial and saying, okay, we're good now. Okay? I don't want to say we're even, but we're good now. I guess is a way to put it. And also that he's reminding Peter that, I may not have been there, but I know. So, but look at what he says. When you dress yourself and went where you wanted, but when you are old, you will stretch out your hands. In other words, you're not going to go where you wanted. From now on, you're going to go where God leads you. And the more you get into this stuff, you have to ask yourself, man, how smart a guy was this? To be able to write at that time in a way with so much symbolism in it that scholars hundreds of years later are still trying to figure it out. Okay? This guy doesn't write comic books here. This is pretty deep theological stuff. And everybody says, well, they were back then, they couldn't have been that smart. Well, guess what? And the letters of Paul are the same way.
Yeah, but maybe God was directing them what to
Yeah,
do,
exactly.
you know, kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. That's part of it, but the fact of the matter was, it's in a way that if you really look at it, it's all there. And again, Jesus is also acting this stuff out, so he has to understand the symbolism of what he's doing too.
Why did God allow the disciples to be martyred in such a way?
That's an excellent question. Well, for one thing, it proved their commitment. It's like Nathan Hale, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. You know, that kind of a commitment. Also, there were a whole lot of people running around out there that were unpredictable. Nero was certainly unpredictable, and he was the guy involved in this. And the other question, and we should probably investigate it someday, is why were all of the Roman Christians brought to the arena and done that to them? You know, they didn't do anything wrong. So there's a whole lot of discussion about things like that. But like I said, I can bring in someday because we don't have anything actual. What we kind of do, there's a whole bunch of books that never made it into the Bible that describe supposedly some of the things that each of these disciples did. So there's a you know, for every one that made it in the Bible, there's probably 2 or 3 that didn't. I mean, there's all kinds of, there's even strange ones about Jesus, about how he, you know, made butterflies come to life when he was a kid and things like that. So, but there was what they called the canon, which was in the late, it was about 170 AD. And that's when a whole bunch of scholars got together and said, this one's in, this one's out, this one's in, this one's out, this one's in, this one's out. And that's when the Bible as we know it came about.
If you were a disciple and you were getting martyred any kind of way, wouldn't you think that, oh geez, I'm a follower and this is what I get?
Well, it's the same logic as a suicide bomber in a way. Most suicide bombers think they're doing it because the life after is so much better. They're convinced of that. And Jesus is convinced of them that, you know, remember, he says, if you do these things in my name, I will take care of you. So that's probably, you know, what motivated them. Remember, as I keep telling you, these guys were standing in that room the day after the day of the resurrection, scared to death. They didn't want to come outside. And after Jesus appears to them twice, now they're spread out going across the world. Now something must have happened in there, regardless of what anybody says, to make them do that. Okay? Something powerful had to happen to make them do that. Like you said, Dave, to be able to face that should it ever come up. Remember, John wasn't martyred, but he was exiled.
Yeah, but he wasn't killed. Right?
No, but he was put on an island basically by himself. So, no, it's Patmos, I think is the name of the island. But they put him on an island, you know, because they were afraid to kill him, but they had to shut him up somehow. So they put him as far away from people as they could get him. So even he wasn't so lucky. I mean, Paul talks about being martyred a lot in his letters. He knows it's coming. Well, Peter was martyred by the Romans, yes. John was exiled by the Romans. He was, you know, because the Romans covered that entire area. And I don't know where the island of Patmos is, but it's kind of like isolated from everybody.
They
obviously somebody had to, you know, because most of these people, when they wrote books, they had stenographers or secretaries and translators or somebody that would write it all out. And because that was a skill in those days. I don't know if you've ever seen a codex, but Mac Peel had one. It's about this wide. It's papyrus or something, you know, or maybe like an animal skin, and it's characters all the way across, no punctuation, because they couldn't afford to waste the space. So somebody had to write it in a way that someone else could read it and then translate it back the way we've done it.
So the actual disciples didn't really write it.
Well, they basically, you know, if you ever see a book that says, a book written by so-and-so as told to,
Yes.
that's basically what you have here.
So John did all of his writing before he was exiled?
No, not all of it. I think Revelation he wrote while he was exiled.
And then somebody had to be with them.
And somebody had to be with him, yeah. So, and then everybody says, well, he must have been spaced out on something, whatever, you know. But we can get into that at some later point. The point of the matter is that, remember, after these events, John moved to Ephesus to do what? Jesus gave him a specific job to do. Take care of who? His mother. So if you recall, when we had the video in here, it showed the house that supposedly John and Mary were living in Ephesus. It's still there. Supposedly. I tell you supposedly because a lot of these things were identified by Emperor Constantine's mother. And she had these people go around and figure out where all the events in the Bible took place. No one really knows whether that's really the place or not. Just happened to be what she said. It's like in Bethlehem, there's supposedly the birth spot. That's because Constantine's mother's, whoever she sent out there, decided that that's where it was going to go. Nobody really knows if that was the exact spot or not. But we say it is, and there's actually the Catholic Church, you know, caretakes it. There's a caretaker down there. But
we weren't there, so we don't know.
Exactly, we weren't there, so we don't really know. But then again, you know, but so basically, you've got this going on now. Then there's the end of the witness to Christ, and that's 20 to 24 in chapter 21. Who would like to read that?
Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following him. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at supper and had said, Lord, who is going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he asked, Lord, what about him? Jesus answered, if I want him to remain until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me. Because of this, the rumor spread among the brothers that the disciple would not die. But Jesus did not say that he would not die. He only said, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true.
Okay. Remember you asked about very old? He was very old. So people honestly were believing he was going to live till the second coming, which means he'd still be alive today. Didn't work out that way. But notice the way he wrote that. He said, he didn't really say that. He said that if I want him to be alive, he'll be there. That's a strange way of putting it. But basically what he's saying, Dave, is, you know, I gave you a job, Peter. Don't worry about him. You know, I gave you a job. Now I'm going to give him one. So William Barclay takes this one step forward, and he does it very, 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 very deftly, if you will. He says, this passage makes it quite clear that John must have lived to a very old age. He must have lived on until the report went around that he was going to go on living until Jesus came again. Now, just as the previous passage assigned Peter to his place in the scheme of things, this one assigns John to his place. It was his function to be preeminently the witness to Christ. Again, people in the early church must have made their comparisons. They must have pointed out how Paul went away to the ends of the earth. They must have pointed out how Peter went here and there shepherding his people. And they must have wondered what the function of John was, who had lived on in Ephesus until he was so old he was past all activity. Well, here is the answer. Paul might be the pioneer of Christ, Peter might be the shepherd of Christ, but John was the witness of Christ. He was the one who was able to say, I saw these things and I know they are true. To this day, the final argument for Christianity is Christian experience. To this day, Christians are people who can say, I know Jesus Christ and I know these things are true. So at the end, this gospel takes two of the great figures of the church, Peter and John. To each, Jesus has given his function. It was Peter's to shepherd the sheep of the church, and in the end to die for him. It was John's to witness the story of Christ and to live to a great old age and come to the end in peace. This did not make them rivals in honor and prestige, nor did it make one greater or less than the other. It made them both servants of Jesus Christ. So in these passages, each one is sent in a different direction. Now, Dave, what Peter said, hey, I want that job, I want his job, you can have mine. I don't know. But Peter sounded to be like the type of guy who wouldn't like to be sitting around writing stuff all the time. He was a man of action. And Jesus recognized that. So basically, William Barclay concludes this, though. He said, each of us should serve Christ where Christ has sent us. Jesus said to Peter, never mind the task that is given to someone else. Your job is to follow me. That is what he still says to each one of us. Our glory is never in comparison with others. Our glory is in the service of Christ in whatever capacity he has allotted to us. Think of it, that little, what is that? 3 little paragraphs translates into all of these pages in a commentary. That shows you how powerful the words are in here for somebody who really wants to get into it. Now, there's one last thing in the book. Now, remember what we read to start with. How does this sound? Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. Does he sound like he ended it again? Yeah, so he comes up with another ending to the ending. But notice what he says. If every one of them were written down, I suppose even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written.
That would be written.
And he's talking about, because he assumes that, he doesn't know he's one of the few actually writing these. He's figuring all kinds of people are writing. And remember what I told you, there's a whole lot of books out there that never made the Bible. A whole lot of them. There's also the Apocrypha, which did not make our Bible, but made the Catholic Bible. And there's, I don't know how many books are in there, at least 6 or 7. And if you, every once in a while, you can buy a Bible, and they put some in the middle between the Old and the New Testament. I don't think this one has it, but the one I have at home does. And so the question has always been asked: are these real books of the Bible? Well, some people say yes, some people say no. But there, as I told you, there was a canon where they actually decided, okay, this one's in, this one's in, this one's in, and they decided what order to put them in. Now, we also have the 3 letters of John in the back of the New Testament. Those were the last three that went in. You know, we could do a Bible study on 3rd John, for instance, but it would take us like 15 minutes. Because there's 2nd John, and there's 3rd John. That's the whole book. That's those two little letters. And they were the last ones to be admitted to the canon. Because there was a big argument about whether they should be part of this or not. Because they were so short.
The books that did not read it, are they all books that relate to Jesus' lifetime, or is there anything written at all about this 400 years span?
Not really. They're either about Jesus himself, or some of them are about the various disciples and their travels. Okay? And no one really knows who wrote them. As I told you, these disciples went off like in all kinds of different directions. Thomas, for example, as I told you a couple of weeks ago, is believed to have got as far away as India.
And he got murdered too?
No, he did all right. He was far enough away from that.
That's what I was gonna say, if you travel really far away. Then
No, but there is still a church in India
yeah, that's what
that
you
traces their roots back to him. Now, if you want to look at a map and see how far it is to walk from Jerusalem to India, go ahead. You're not going to do it in a couple of days. It's going to take for a long, long time. It might have taken him, remember how long it used to take pioneers to start from St. Joe, Missouri and end up in Oregon? Well, I mean, that's what we're talking about here. Now, he may have taken a caravan or two or something like that, but just to get there was a travel in itself. And they knew very little about some of these outlying areas. You know, they knew very little about India. Nobody had ever spoken about it. Very few had ever been there.
Did the disciples know what happened to each other?
It's not likely, because they were so far away from each other. Now, somehow John knew about Peter, okay? Probably because somebody went and told him. But there were people in Ethiopia, there were people in Africa. I mean, just like I said, every time you read one of these stories, it starts out with the words "tradition says," or the book something, you know, the travels of somebody says. And those books never made the Bible for whatever reason. I guess they couldn't. There's a whole section on what it takes to be declared a part of what it took to be declared a part of the canon. And also, you know, they call it criticism, and then there's specific criticism and all that kind of thing. For example, when they take the letters of Paul, they look at the sentence structures and how he uses nouns and verbs, and they are able to determine that these letters were consistent across each other because of the fact that the writing style was exactly the same. But imagine the work it took to do that. It'd be like a code breaker in World War II, where you put out all these, you know, oddball letters, and you try to guess based on the number of times a certain letter appears in a certain language, and trying to figure out, you know, if it fits or not. Well, that's what they do with a lot of that stuff. So they know that at least 8 of the letters Paul wrote are authentic. Letter to the Hebrews, on the other hand, is some people say he wrote it. Most people say he didn't. There was a big to-do on Jeopardy about that. Because if I was on Final Jeopardy, the question was which of Paul's letters used the, forget, a certain word the most times. And they said it was Hebrews, and Mac Peel said Paul never wrote the letter to the Hebrews. Sharon Core, our executive presbyter, said that Paul never wrote the letter to the Hebrews. They got all kinds of mail. But it turns out that in the King James Version, in the first sentence, it says that Paul wrote it, and that was their source, so they're sticking by him. So there was a lot of work that went into this, as to determine, you know, whether these things were worthy. The other thing is, in the Old Testament, for example, those books are not lined up in historic order. They're lined up by topic. So basically, the group of the canon decided that the first 5 books of the Pentateuch, that's what the Jewish people call their Bible. So we're going to keep them together. Then there was the prophets. They kept those books together. And then there was the Psalms, which covered all kinds of, and Proverbs, which are not really books. So they kept those 2 together. And so basically, they were all done topically. So sometimes you would read a book. In the beginning, what seemed like the beginning of the Old Testament, that actually is older than some of the books that came later on. So it's kind of like what's going to happen with the committee tonight when they try to decide which 4 teams are going to play in the college playoff. Same sort of thing, you know, or which 32 teams are going to make the NCAA field. I mean, basically this is what was going on. And this did not take like a week. They spent years on this. And once they did it, it was done. And then when, you know why it's called the King James Version, don't you? King James decided to do it. James the First. So he gathered all the biblical scholars he could find and said, write me a Bible!
King James English?
In England, yes. So they wrote the Bible, and they decided what to put in it and what not to put in it and all that other kind of stuff. So they improved on the canon. And that's why everybody's been using the King James Bible ever since. They think that all those words are holy words. In fact, that's the way people talked in 1601. So it's not the first time. And now today you get all of these new versions of the Bible. Some of them are really cool. The Message is one that's selling quite well lately. The Message, it comes across as a very powerful, down-to-earth 20th to 21st century version of what that says. And a lot of people love it. And I have Bibles at home where it's got 4 versions next to each other, and you can go across and compare them.
It makes a difference if it's written in contemporary language or not.
Well,
I mean, as far as whether people feel that it's watered down isn't exactly the right word, but you know what I'm.
I know exactly what you're saying.
Not as true to the.
Linda and I used to go to a church that was pastored by my philosophy teacher, Dr. Dell. And he preached from a version that was written by a bunch of recovering alcoholics. And it was, you know, the 23rd Psalm was something like God for the rhinos or something like that.
God is my probation officer.
What's that? God is my probation officer. Yeah. So basically, the person who wrote his logic was, if you're going to talk to people and understand a probation officer, let's talk to them in their language. Martin Luther translated the Bible into languages because before that it was in Latin. And a lot of the priests said, well, it takes away from the value of it. No, it doesn't.
Get the message across one way or the other.
Remember, Paul said, I'll do anything I can think of to gain one more convert. But I did tell Thelma I'm not going to wear an elf suit. No elf suits this Christmas.
Elf suit.
An elf suit, yes. Although John wore his elf hat yesterday. Did you see him in his elf hat?
John does a lot of things you don't.
But he looked good in the elf hat.
Well, when I walked in the other day on work day, he had a tail, he had a curly tail, it's a long you know, it's one of those things, you know, he has a good time and everybody else enjoys it, so, you know, that's all that counts, you know.
I don't know where he hides those things.
Oh, he has a little secret stash of stuff. you know.
Because he wore the turkey last month.
Yeah, he's
With the
good.
legs sticking
He
out.
cracks me up.
Well, I'm glad we have it. Anyway, thanks a lot for sitting through this Bible study. I think we're gonna, stop here for now, and
Okay,
in the spring we'll take up another topic.